You've probably already had some experience with and maybe even familiarity with the terms around the idea of scope, that variables can be accessed only in particular places and they sort of cease to exist outside of those places. And that in the same scope, we usually can't define two variables with the same name either. So let's refresh some of those ideas and then build on them by thinking about the variables in this code here, where there's a method called do something, it has an integer x, it prints some stuff, creates an integer y, uses a for loop over the integer I, and then prints a little more inside there and prints at the end. We want to think about x, y, and I in that method. And in particular, where can x be accessed or changed? Where can y be accessed or changed? And where can I be accessed or changed? So take a moment and think about that. Pause the video and think. You may already have figured out all of the details of these here, and that would be just fine. X can be accessed in the whole method from lines 2 through 9. It won't be accessible at line 10, and it didn't exist yet at line 1, so it's only accessible inside of the body of the method, so inside the whole body of the method. And that's because it's a parameter. Actually, we're going to record that. It's a parameter. It's accessible inside of the body of the method. Y can be accessed most of the places that X can, but it doesn't exist right away like X does. Y can only be accessed in lines 4 through 9 because it's a local variable and it had to be declared before it could be used at all. You couldn't do anything with Y up here before it's declared. And I is somewhat similar, that it gets declared at line 5, so it can be accessed in parts of line 5 there and changed and other things done to it, but it stops existing at the end of the loop. This is not true in all languages, but it's true in Java, that when the block that something exists or was declared in stops, then that variable stops existing too. It's a loop variable or it belongs to a particular block. So these are limited scopes that all fall within the space of the particular method that we are working with here. We're going to think today about a new scope of variable that is fields or instance variables. They belong to classes. So class variables, in particular, fields and instance variables, or these are two names that people will interchangeably use for things that belong to a class. There is one other type of class variable that we will only deal with a little bit, and that is static class variables. We won't use them too terribly often, but they are another type. In particular, we'll focus on fields and instance variables. So with fields and instance variables, they belong to the object that's created, and they can be used anywhere inside of the class. So fields can be used anywhere inside of the class. They belong to the particular object that has been instantiated of this type. So, for example, the x of a point belongs to the particular point that was created there. And we're able to use them. So, for instance, if this do something function was in the point class that has an x and a y, so say we had defined a public class point that had an x and a y to it, public class point, and it had, we'll only define the x, private int x, then we're able to use the X from that point. We can even say Y there. And we can use that anywhere inside of that point class that we're imagining that we're writing here. This might lead you to a complication that you can see already, and that is that X exists here and it exists here. It exists as a parameter and as a field, as an instance variable. That's actually okay, but it does add to some complications. So you can have parameters with the same name as the field, but Java will follow a certain set of rules when looking for the variable that you reference. So if you reference X, Java will look for the variable that you're referencing as close to your location as possible. Close, then further away. This means it will look for local things first, it will look at parameters next, then it will look at fields, or in other words, instance variables or static variables, which we won't deal with too much here. But this means that if I wanted to do something with that X, if I just say X in this method here, then I'm referring to the parameter because that's closer than the instance variable is. There is a way to override this by using this dot, like this dot X or this dot name or whatever you're referring to. That tells it skip past the local variables and the parameters and look up at the one that belongs to the class, the instance variable there. So it skips that system for where to look for variables, and it says just look straight up there. So if I wanted to print X, for instance, the class's version of X inside of here, I could say system out print line this dot X. And you'll see some more examples of these as you work on parts B and C of your activity, the class activity today.